The clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m., when Christmas Eve officially became the loneliest night of the year in my world. 22 years driving the late-night route through downtown Chicago, and I thought I had seen every variation of human sorrow that December could offer. The elderly woman who rode my bus every Christmas Eve to visit a grave that had been empty for 30 years. The teenage runaway who spent holiday nights on public transportation because shelter beds filled up fast when the temperature dropped below freezing. The businessman who worked Christmas shifts because going home meant facing an empty apartment where stockings had once hung and children's laughter had once echoed through rooms now silent as tombs, but tonight felt different. The air inside the bus carried weight that had nothing to do with the snowflakes pressing against windows, like lost souls seeking warmth. Something about the way streetlights reflected off wet pavement reminded me of tears frozen before they could fall, and the usual holiday decorations hanging from storefronts seemed to mock rather than celebrate the season of hope and joy that everyone else seemed to experience. My route starts at Union Station and winds through neighborhoods where Christmas lights compete with neon signs, advertising 24-hour liquor stores and all-night diners that serve as refuges for people who have nowhere else to go when the world shuts down for family gatherings they will never attend. I know these streets like the lines on my weathered hands, know which corners produce passengers running from something, and which bus stops shelter people running toward dreams that may never materialize. 22 years of watching human stories unfold in the fluorescent-lit theater of public transportation has taught me to read faces like road maps, to recognize the geography of pain and the landmarks of hope in equal measure. The first passengers of the night climbed aboard with the shuffling gait of people who had learned to expect disappointment from life. A hospital worker finishing a double shift, her scrubs wrinkled and her eyes holding the exhaustion of someone who had spent Christmas Eve watching other people die. A college student heading home to parents who had never understood why she chose sociology over business, carrying textbooks and the burden of being the first in her family to pursue education that would never translate into the kind of success they recognized. An elderly man clutching a paper bag that smelled like Chinese takeout and loneliness, probably spending Christmas Eve the same way he had spent the last dozen Christmas Eves since his wife had passed away from the cancer that had slowly consumed their retirement savings along with her life. Normal passengers carrying normal sadness on a normal night that happened to coincide with the anniversary of hope that most of the world celebrates with family dinners and wrapped presents, and children who believe in magic because adults have conspired to maintain their innocence for a few more precious years. Then he appeared at the Fullerton Avenue stop like a ghost materialized from winter fog and fluorescent light pollution. Tall and thin, maybe 45 years old, wearing a navy blue coat that had seen better decades and carrying himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to hold broken pieces together through sheer force of will. His hair was prematurely gray at the temples, and his eyes held the particular shade of blue that reminded me of summer skies reflected in deep water, beautiful but somehow distant and unreachable. But it was what he carried in his arms that stopped my breath and made time slow down like honey poured from a cold jar. A bundle wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, small and still and cradled with the tenderness that only fathers possess when they hold their children against the uncertainties of a world that had failed to protect innocence the way it should. He paid his fare with quarters that jingled in his palm like wind chimes, and his voice when he whispered thank you carried the quality of someone who had forgotten how to speak above a whisper because loud noises might disturb something precious and fragile. He chose a seat near the back, away from the other passengers, and settled the bundle in his lap, with movements so gentle they seemed choreographed by angels. The hospital worker glanced up from her phone, smiled at what she assumed was a father traveling with his sleeping child on Christmas Eve, then returned to her text messages with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to seeing families navigate the complexities of holiday travel. The college student adjusted her earbuds and lost herself in music that probably drowned out the sound of her own thoughts. The elderly man continued eating his takeout, methodically consuming fried rice that tasted like solitude and regret. None of them heard what I heard when the man in the navy coat began to sing. The melody started so softly that at first I thought it was wind whistling through the bus ventilation system, or the distant sound of radio music bleeding through someone's headphones. But slowly, gradually, the tune took shape and became recognizable as a lullaby that every parent has sung to every child since the beginning of recorded time. Rock-a-bye, baby. On the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. His voice was untrained but pure, carrying the melody with the reverence of a prayer and the heartbreak of a confession spoken to God in the darkness of a cathedral where no one else was listening. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. The words drifted through the bus like smoke from extinguished candles, settling into the spaces between passenger conversations and the rumble of tires on wet asphalt. But something in his voice suggested that this lullaby carried different meaning than the innocent children's song most people remembered from their own childhood. There was weight in every note, history in every pause between verses, and love so deep and desperate that it transformed familiar words into something approaching sacred music. I adjusted my rear-view mirror to get a better look at the man and his bundle, expecting to see a sleeping infant or toddler, perhaps a young child who had fallen asleep during a long journey home for Christmas Eve dinner with grandparents or extended family who lived across the city from wherever this father called home. Instead, what I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and my breath catch in my throat, like words too painful to speak aloud. The bundle in his arms was perfectly still, unnaturally still, with the complete absence of movement that could only mean one thing. No rise and fall of tiny chest breathing, no slight shifts of position that sleeping children make as they dream of toys and playgrounds and birthday parties. No soft sounds of infant sleep that parents learn to recognize as the symphony of life continuing in small bodies that depend completely on adult protection and love. The yellow blanket wrapped something that would never again respond to lullabies or bedtime stories or Christmas morning excitement or any of the thousand small joys that make childhood magical for those lucky enough to experience it, surrounded by love and safety, and adults who understand that protecting innocence is the most important responsibility any society can accept. But still he sang, his voice growing stronger and more beautiful with each repetition of the melody, as if the act of singing could somehow bridge the gap between presence and absence, between hope and heartbreak, between the child who had once responded to this same lullaby and the memory that was all he had left to hold against his chest on a Christmas Eve that would never again be about joy and anticipation and the magic of believing in possibilities that adults know are unlikely, but children accept as inevitable. The bus continued its route through streets that seemed suddenly aware of their audience, as if the city itself had noticed the man singing lullabies to silence and adjusted its rhythm accordingly. Traffic lights held their green phases longer, allowing us to glide through intersections without the jarring stops that usually punctuate urban travel. Other vehicles gave us wider berth, their drivers unconsciously responding to something they could not name or understand, but somehow felt through windshields and winter air. Even the snowfall outside seemed more gentle, flakes descending like confetti at a celebration that had been postponed indefinitely due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. I found myself driving more carefully than usual, taking corners with extra caution and accelerating so gradually that the motion felt like floating rather than mechanical movement through space and time. Part of me understood, without being told, that sudden movements or loud noises would be inappropriate in the presence of whatever tragedy was unfolding in the seat near the back of my bus, where a father continued singing to a child who would never again hear his voice or feel the comfort of being held close against the uncertainties of a world that had proven itself capable of breaking even the most precious things. The other passengers remained unaware of the true nature of what was happening, just a few rows away from their own private struggles with loneliness and disappointment, and the particular sadness that accompanies holidays when you are surrounded by other people's joy, but cannot access it yourself. The hospital worker had fallen asleep with her head against the window, exhaustion finally overcoming the caffeine that had carried her through 16 hours of caring for other people while her own needs went unmet and unacknowledged. The college student had pulled a textbook from her backpack and was reading by the overhead light, probably studying for exams that would resume after New Year's Day, when the world returned to its normal rhythm of deadlines and expectations and competition for grades that might translate into opportunities for success that looked nothing like the dreams she had carried when she first decided to pursue education that her family considered impractical and self-indulgent. The elderly man had finished his takeout and was staring out the window at Christmas decorations that probably reminded him of holidays when he had been part of a family unit, when Christmas Eve had meant children and grandchildren and the organized chaos of multiple generations gathered around dinner tables, laden with food that tasted like love and tradition, and the continuity of family stories passed down through recipes and rituals that create the foundation of belonging that some people take for granted, until death removes the people who made belonging possible. But I heard everything, every note of the lullaby that continued with slight variations, sometimes traditional verses that every parent knows by heart, and sometimes improvised words that seem to come from some deep place where grief and love meet and create their own language that only broken hearts can speak fluently. Hush, little baby. Don't say a word. Daddy's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird won't sing, Daddy's gonna buy you a diamond ring. The familiar promises that parents make to children, bargains with the universe that assume a future full of opportunities to deliver on commitments that sometimes become impossible to keep, due to circumstances that no amount of love or planning or careful attention can prevent. His voice never wavered, never cracked with emotion, never betrayed the magnitude of whatever loss he was carrying in his arms, like a burden that had become sacred through the simple act of refusing to let go. Instead, he sang with the steady devotion of someone performing a ritual that had meaning beyond the understanding of observers, a ceremony of love that would continue until some internal timing mechanism told him that he had sung enough songs, said enough goodbyes, held on long enough to honor whatever relationship had been severed by forces beyond his control or comprehension. 20 minutes into the route, we stopped at North Avenue to let off the college student, who gathered her textbooks and her determination to succeed in spite of family disapproval, and walked into the night, toward whatever form of home awaited her arrival. Before the doors closed, she glanced back at the man with the bundle and smiled with the automatic politeness that young people offer to strangers who appear to be engaged in normal parental activities, unaware that she was witnessing something that would stay with her for the rest of her life once she understood what she had actually seen. The hospital worker woke up as we approached her stop near Northwestern Memorial, where she would probably return in 8 hours to begin another shift caring for people whose families would gather around hospital beds, hoping for Christmas miracles that medical science could not guarantee. She looked tired beyond her years, carrying the accumulated weight of witnessing human suffering as a profession, but her expression softened when she heard the lullaby that continued to fill the bus with gentle melody and heartbreak, disguised as tenderness. "Beautiful," she whispered as she passed the man on her way to the exit, and he nodded acknowledgement without interrupting his song or looking up from the bundle that commanded all of his attention and devotion. She paused at the door for just a moment, and I could see in her reflection that she recognized something in his posture or his voice, or the careful way he held whatever he was carrying, some professional understanding of loss that comes from spending years around people who are learning to say goodbye to things they cannot bear to lose. But she did not intrude or ask questions or offer the kind of sympathy that well-meaning strangers sometimes provide without invitation. Instead, she stepped off the bus and disappeared into the winter night, leaving us with one fewer witness to whatever ceremony of love and loss was continuing in the seat near the back, where a father sang Christmas Eve lullabies to silence that somehow sang back in ways that only he could hear. Now it was just me, the elderly man and the singer, traveling through a city that sparkled with lights that celebrated hope and joy, and the magic of believing in possibilities that most adults understand are unlikely, but choose to embrace anyway, because the alternative is surrendering to despair that serves no useful purpose and brings no comfort to anyone. The decorations outside looked different now, less like commercial attempts to encourage spending, and more like genuine expressions of the human need to create beauty in darkness, to insist on celebration even when circumstances suggest that mourning would be more appropriate. This is the moment when I want to pause and tell you something important, something that has been weighing on my heart throughout this entire journey. You see, I have been driving this route for 22 years, and in all that time I have witnessed countless stories of human struggle and resilience. I have seen people at their lowest moments and their highest, carried passengers who were fleeing violence, and others who were traveling toward hope, watch strangers become temporary family members during the brief time they shared space on my bus. But tonight feels different, special in a way that makes me want to share it with you, to invite you into this story that is still unfolding as I tell it. because sometimes we encounter moments that remind us of our common humanity, that show us love expressed in ways we had never imagined, that demonstrate the power of devotion to transform even tragedy into something approaching sacred. If this story is touching your heart the way it has touched mine, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel and sharing your own experiences in the comments below. Not because I need the validation or the numbers, but because stories like these deserve to be heard and remembered and passed along to people who understand that the most profound human experiences often happen in unexpected places, witnessed by strangers who become temporary guardians of moments too precious to be lost to time and forgetting. You are not just an audience to me. You are fellow travelers on this journey through human experience, people who understand that the most important stories are not always the loudest ones, and that sometimes the greatest acts of love happen in silence, witnessed only by those who happen to be present when love refuses to surrender to loss. The elderly man was the next to leave us, gathering his empty takeout containers and his dignity as we approached the Diversey stop, where he would probably walk to an apartment that smelled like loneliness and old coffee and the accumulation of years spent learning to be alone after decades of sharing space with someone whose presence had made solitude feel like choice rather than circumstance. Before he stood up, he listened to several complete verses of the lullaby that continued to fill the bus with melody that somehow made the fluorescent lighting seem warmer and the vinyl seats feel less institutional and cold. He paused as he passed the singing man, reached into his coat pocket, and withdrew something small that glinted in the overhead light. A silver dollar, old and worn smooth by countless hands, the kind of coin that grandfathers keep for luck or memory, or the simple pleasure of having something solid and real to hold when the world feels too abstract and uncertain. Without saying a word, he placed it gently on the seat next to the man with the bundle, a gesture of respect or understanding or solidarity that transcended the need for explanation or acknowledgement. The singing man looked up for the first time since boarding, met the elderly passenger's eyes, and nodded once with gratitude that seemed to encompass more than thanks for a simple coin. It was recognition between two people who understood loss in ways that required no verbal communication, a moment of connection that bridged whatever differences in age or experience or specific circumstances had brought each of them to this bus on Christmas Eve, when most of the world was gathered around warmth and celebration and the comfort of family traditions. After the elderly man disappeared into the night, we were alone together, the singing father and I, traveling through a city that had grown quieter as the evening progressed toward midnight, and Christmas Day officially arrived for everyone, except those of us who were still traveling through the darkness between what was and what would never be again. The lullabies continued, sometimes traditional songs and sometimes melodies that seemed improvised, created in the moment for an audience of one who could no longer respond, but whose memory apparently deserved every note, every word, every ounce of love that could be expressed through music that transformed the ordinary bus into something approaching a mobile chapel. I began to understand that I was not simply driving a route through Chicago streets, but serving as witness to a ritual of goodbye that required privacy and time, and the gentle motion of travel from one place to another, while the singer completed whatever internal process had brought him to my bus on Christmas Eve, with a bundle that represented the most profound loss any parent can experience. The responsibility felt both heavier and more sacred than anything I had encountered in 22 years of carrying strangers through their personal journeys toward destinations they hoped would somehow be better than the places they were leaving behind. The snow outside had intensified, not enough to create dangerous driving conditions, but sufficient to muffle the sounds of traffic and transform the familiar urban landscape into something softer and more mysterious, as if the city itself was participating in the ceremony by providing appropriate atmosphere for rituals that required beauty and quiet, and the kind of privacy that can only be found in public spaces where strangers respect boundaries without being asked and understand that some moments are too precious to disturb with curiosity or well-meaning interference. We passed through the Lincoln Park neighborhood, where Christmas lights reflected off snow-covered trees and windows glowed with warm yellow light that spoke of families gathered around dinner tables and children excited about presents that would be opened in a few hours when Christmas morning officially began. The contrast between the celebration happening behind those windows and the profound sadness happening on my bus created a tension that felt almost unbearable, as if joy and sorrow were competing for dominance in a universe too small to contain both emotions simultaneously without breaking apart from the pressure. But somehow the singing continued to hold everything together, creating space where contradictions could coexist and where the deepest human experiences could unfold without requiring resolution or explanation or comfort that no one was equipped to provide anyway. The lullabies had become more than entertainment for a child who could no longer hear them. They had transformed into something approaching prayer, a conversation with forces beyond human understanding, an insistence that love continues even when its object is no longer present to receive it. My own memories began to surface as I listened to melodies that every parent knows, and most adults remember from their own childhood, when someone who loved them had sung these same songs during bedtime rituals that created the foundation of security and belonging that shapes everything that comes afterward. I thought about my daughter Sarah, now 28 and living in Seattle with her own family, children I see twice a year during visits that are too short and too formal and too careful, conversations that dance around subjects we cannot discuss without risking the delicate peace we have maintained since her mother and I divorced. When Sarah was 12, and the world became complicated in ways that require adult skills she was too young to possess. I wondered if I had sung to her enough when she was small, if I had provided sufficient foundation of love and security to sustain her through the years when I was not present to offer protection or guidance, or the simple comfort of knowing that someone who loved her completely was available whenever the world became too difficult to navigate alone. The regret that accompanies all parental reflection settled in my chest like weight that could not be lifted or set aside, only carried forward with the hope that love offered imperfectly is still better than no love at all. The singing man seemed to sense my emotional state without looking up from his bundle or interrupting his lullabies, but something in the melody shifted, became more inclusive, as if he was singing not just for the child he held, but for all the children who had ever needed lullabies and all the parents who had ever tried to provide comfort through songs that promised protection they could not guarantee, and security they could not control and love that would persist even when presence was no longer possible. Rock-a-bye baby, on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. The words carried different meaning now, less like innocent children's entertainment, and more like philosophical meditation on the fragility of safety and the temporary nature of protection and the courage required to love completely despite knowing that loss is inevitable, and heartbreak is the price we pay for allowing ourselves to care about things we cannot control or preserve forever. We were approaching the downtown area, where my route would soon end, and passengers would be required to transfer to other buses or find alternative transportation to whatever destinations awaited their arrival. I realized that I did not want this journey to end, did not want to return the singing man to a world that would expect him to resume normal activities and pretend that carrying his loss was something he could do while also participating in conversations about weather and work schedules. And holiday plans that assumed everyone's Christmas Eve had been spent in preparation for celebration, rather than traveling through the night with bundles that would never again respond to lullabies or bedtime stories or any of the 1,000 small rituals that make childhood magical for those fortunate enough to experience it. The clock on my dashboard showed 12:47 a.m. Christmas Day had officially arrived, though it felt more like the deepest part of night than the beginning of mourning or celebration or hope renewed. Outside, the city continued its transformation under snow that made everything look clean and peaceful and impossibly beautiful, as if winter had conspired with Christmas to create perfect conditions for miracles that most people would sleep through and never recognize as the everyday magic that surrounds us constantly but requires specific kinds of attention to perceive and appreciate. The silver dollar that the elderly man had left on the seat caught light from street lamps and seemed to pulse with reflected illumination, creating small points of brightness that danced across the interior of the bus like stars brought down to earth level where ordinary people could touch them and believe, for just a moment, in possibilities that logic suggested were unlikely, but love insisted were essential for survival in a world that breaks hearts with such reliable frequency that hope becomes an act of rebellion rather than simple optimism. As we entered the final stretch of my route, the singing took on new urgency and beauty, as if the approach of our destination had triggered some internal countdown that measured not miles or minutes, but the amount of love that could be expressed through melody and words that carried meaning beyond their literal definitions. The man's voice had grown stronger throughout the journey, more confident and pure, as if the act of singing had healed something in him that had been damaged by whatever circumstances had brought him to my bus on Christmas Eve, carrying the most profound loss any parent can experience. "Hush, little baby. Don't you cry. Daddy's gonna sing you a lullaby." The improvised verses had become more personal and specific, references to shared experiences and private jokes and memories that belonged exclusively to the relationship between this father and the child, who would never again respond to his voice or reach for his hand, or provide the daily proof that love creates and sustains life in ways that science can measure but never fully explain or replicate through any means other than the mysterious alchemy of devotion that transforms two separate individuals into family units that share identity and purpose, and the kind of bond that persists even when physical presence is no longer possible. I found myself slowing down as we approached Union Station, where my shift would end, and passengers would scatter toward whatever forms of shelter or warmth or human connection they had managed to arrange for themselves on a night when most of the world was asleep in beds, surrounded by family members who took for granted the security and belonging that some people spend their entire lives seeking without ever finding. The singing man would have to leave my bus and continue his journey through grief using other forms of transportation, or simply walking through streets that were beautiful under snow but offered no comfort for losses that could not be repaired, through any amount of beauty or seasonal magic or well-meaning sympathy from strangers who understood nothing about the specific nature of his pain. But as I prepared to announce our arrival at the final stop, something unprecedented happened. The man looked up from the bundle in his arms, met my eyes in the rearview mirror, and spoke for the first time since whispering "thank you" when he had paid his fare hours earlier at Fullerton Avenue, when this journey had begun with what appeared to be normal father traveling with sleeping child, but had transformed into something approaching sacred ritual that had changed both of us in ways we were only beginning to understand. "Driver," he said, and his voice carried the same gentle quality as his singing, words spoken with care and consideration for their impact on listeners who had become involuntary participants in his process of saying goodbye to whatever he held in the yellow blanket that had remained perfectly still throughout our travels. "Would you mind driving for a little while longer? I can pay extra fare. I just need more time." The request violated every regulation and policy that governed public transportation schedules and route management, and the boundaries between professional responsibility and personal involvement in passenger situations that were none of my business and should not influence decisions about how I operated the vehicle that belonged to the city rather than to me personally. But regulation seemed irrelevant when measured against the need I heard in his voice and the love I had witnessed throughout our journey together through streets that had become witnesses to something that transcended ordinary human experience and entered territory where normal rules no longer applied with their usual authority. "Where would you like to go?" I asked, and the question felt like agreement to participate in whatever conclusion this Christmas Eve journey required, commitment to serve as more than just transportation provider, and to accept responsibility for helping this father complete whatever ritual of love and loss he needed to finish before releasing his child back to whatever realm the dead inhabit when the living finally find courage to let them go. "Anywhere," he replied, and the single word contained trust that I would understand what he meant and choose destinations that would provide appropriate setting for the final stages of his ceremony of goodbye. "Just keep driving, please." So I turned left instead of right at the intersection where my official route ended, drove west toward neighborhoods I had never explored during night shifts, but had passed through during daylight hours, when the world looked different and less mysterious and more predictable than it appeared under snow and streetlights, and the influence of lullabies that transformed ordinary city buses into something approaching mobile chapels where sacred rituals could unfold without interference from authorities who might not understand the importance of allowing love to express itself in ways that comfort regulations could not anticipate or accommodate. The singing resumed as we entered residential areas, where houses displayed Christmas lights that created patterns of red and green and blue across snow-covered lawns and sidewalks, where children would probably build snowmen tomorrow morning before opening presents that parents had hidden in closets and under beds, and in basement storage rooms, while their children slept and dreamed of toys and bicycles and game systems that would occupy their attention for weeks or months before becoming forgotten relics of Christmas mornings that fade into memory and eventually disappear entirely unless someone takes responsibility for preserving them through photographs or stories or rituals that insist on remembering what might otherwise be lost to time and the natural human tendency to focus on present concerns rather than past celebrations. We drove through Wicker Park, where 24-hour diners served coffee and pie to people who could not sleep or chose not to sleep or had nowhere to sleep except in public places that provided warmth and fluorescent lighting, and the company of strangers who understood that sometimes being alone in public feels safer than being alone in private spaces where silence can become overwhelming and thoughts can spiral into territories too dark and dangerous for solo navigation. The singing man's voice filled the bus with melody that seemed to make even the most familiar neighborhoods look magical and mysterious, as if love expressed through music had the power to transform ordinary landscapes into settings worthy of the profound emotions that required expression through ritual and ceremony, and the kind of devoted attention that most people reserve for weddings or funerals or other occasions when life demands that we acknowledge forces larger than individual human experience. I drove without specific destination, following instincts that suggested appropriate routes through parts of the city where Christmas decorations created beauty that would provide suitable backdrop for whatever conclusion this journey was approaching. The bundle in the singing man's arms remained perfectly still, but somehow his continued lullabies had created the illusion that conversation was happening, that responses were being received and acknowledged and incorporated into the ongoing exchange between father and child, that death had interrupted, but love refused to conclude without proper ceremony and adequate time for all the songs that needed to be sung and all the words that needed to be spoken into silence that somehow seemed to listen and respond in ways that only participants in this ritual could perceive and understand. The snow continued falling, not heavily enough to create driving hazards, but sufficient to maintain the magical atmosphere that had surrounded our journey since the singing began and transformed my ordinary bus into something approaching sacred space, where the most profound human experiences could unfold without interference from practical concerns or schedule requirements, or the boundaries that usually separate professional obligation from personal involvement in passenger situations that exceed the normal parameters of public transportation services. Dawn was approaching when we finally returned to Union Station, the eastern horizon showing the first pale suggestions of Christmas Day sunlight that would soon transform the snow-covered city into a winter wonderland that children would photograph and adults would remember as the backdrop for whatever Christmas memories they created. During daylight hours, when the world resumed its normal rhythm of family gatherings and gift exchanges, and dinner tables laden with food that tasted like tradition and belonging, and the continuity of celebrations that connect present moments to past generations and future holidays that depend on current choices to maintain their power to create joy and meaning in lives that sometimes feel too fragile to sustain the weight of hope. The singing had continued throughout our extended journey, sometimes traditional lullabies that every parent knows, and sometimes improvised melodies that seemed to emerge from sources deeper than memory or training, songs that belonged exclusively to the relationship between this father and the child he held in the yellow blanket that had become sacred through hours of devoted attention and love, expressed through music that transformed grief into something approaching prayer. His voice had grown even more beautiful as the night progressed, as if the act of singing had awakened some dormant musical ability that only profound emotion could access and activate and channel into expressions of devotion that transcended ordinary human communication. As I parked the bus in its designated space and prepared to end my shift, the singing man looked up from the bundle and smiled with such radiance and peace that I understood something had been completed during our journey together through snow-covered streets that had served as witnesses to ritual that could not have unfolded in any other setting or under any other circumstances. The child he had carried onto my bus hours earlier would not be getting off with him, but somehow the love between them had been fully expressed and properly honored, and given the ceremonial conclusion that every profound relationship deserves, when death creates the need for farewells that must be spoken into silence, that somehow knows how to listen and respond and provide the comfort that only completion can offer to hearts that have been broken beyond repair, but refuse to surrender to despair. Without first celebrating everything beautiful that had existed before, loss made celebration seem impossible. "Thank you," he whispered as he stood up, still holding the bundle with the same tenderness and care he had shown throughout our travels. But now there was something different in his posture, some subtle shift that suggested resolution had been achieved and peace had been negotiated with forces that had seemed implacable and hostile when our journey began, but had somehow been transformed into allies that understood the importance of allowing love to express itself completely before accepting the necessity of letting go. He walked toward the exit with steady steps that showed none of the uncertainty or hesitation that had characterized his boarding at Fullerton Avenue, when he had appeared like a ghost emerging from winter fog and fluorescent light pollution. Now he moved with purpose and dignity, and the quiet confidence of someone who had completed important work that required courage and commitment and the willingness to expose private emotions to the observation of strangers who might not understand, but who had nevertheless served as witnesses to ceremonies that needed witnesses in order to achieve their full power to heal and transform and create meaning from experiences that initially appeared to offer nothing but devastation and loss. Before he stepped off the bus, he turned back one final time and placed the silver dollar that the elderly man had given him on the driver's seat next to me, along with a small piece of paper folded carefully and written in handwriting that looked like it belonged in love letters or thank you notes or the kind of personal communication that people create when they want their words to carry weight and permanence and the capacity to provide comfort long after the conversation has ended. "Her name was Lucy," he said softly, and those 4 words contained more information about love and loss and the preciousness of individual human lives than most people convey through hours of detailed explanation and analysis. She was 3 years old. She loved lullabies. Then he walked into the Christmas morning sunlight that was beginning to illuminate the snow-covered city with golden light that made everything look new and clean and full of possibility, carrying his bundle with the same devotion he had shown throughout our journey, but now also carrying something else, some quality of resolution or acceptance or peace that had not been present when he first appeared at my bus stop, looking like a man who had lost everything that made life worth living, and had no idea how to continue existing in a world that had proven itself capable of taking away the most precious things without warning or explanation, or the courtesy of providing time to prepare for losses that no amount of preparation could make endurable. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time after he disappeared, holding the silver dollar and the folded paper, and trying to process what I had witnessed during the night that had begun as an ordinary Christmas Eve shift carrying ordinary passengers through familiar routes, but had transformed into something approaching sacred experience that would change how I understood my role as witness to human stories that unfold in public transportation vehicles, where strangers temporarily share space and, sometimes without intending to do so, share the most profound moments of their lives with people they will never see again, but who become permanent holders of memories too precious to be lost to time and forgetting. When I finally unfolded the paper, I found a brief message written in careful script that looked like it had been composed with great attention to word choice and meaning. "Thank you for giving me time to say goodbye properly. Lucy will always remember the beautiful Christmas Eve when her daddy sang her to sleep for the last time. Some gifts can only be given once, but they last forever. Your kindness allowed me to give her the gift of lullabies that will play in whatever realm she inhabits now, whenever she needs to remember that she was loved completely by someone who will carry that love until we meet again in whatever place awaits people who refuse to let death end the relationships that define who they are and why they matter, and how they choose to live in a world that breaks hearts but also sometimes provides opportunities for those broken hearts to heal through acts of service and witness and the simple human kindness of allowing love to express itself completely before accepting the necessity of letting go." I have kept that note in my wallet for 6 months now, reading it whenever I need to remember that the most important work we do as human beings often happens in moments when we choose compassion over convenience, understanding over judgment, service over self-protection. The silver dollar sits on my kitchen table at home, catching sunlight through windows that frame views of neighbors' yards, where children play and laugh and create the kind of memories that will sustain them through whatever losses and heartbreaks await them. In futures none of us can predict or control, but all of us hope will contain more love than sorrow, more connection than isolation, more opportunities to witness beauty than reasons to despair about the fragility of everything we hold precious. Every Christmas Eve since then, I volunteer to drive the late-night routes, hoping to encounter other passengers who might need more than transportation from one geographical location to another. Because sometimes the most important destinations are not places you can find on maps, but states of resolution and peace and completion that can only be reached through human connection and the willingness to serve as witness to rituals that transform ordinary moments into sacred experiences, that remind us why love matters more than efficiency and why kindness deserves to interrupt schedules when circumstances require more than professional service and impersonal competence. Thank you for traveling with me through this story that continues to shape how I understand my responsibility to pay attention to the people who cross my path during night shifts, when the world grows quiet enough to hear lullabies sung to silence, that somehow knows how to listen and respond, and provide comfort that only love can offer to hearts that have been broken but refuse to surrender to despair, without first celebrating everything beautiful that existed before. Loss made celebration seem impossible. If this story has touched you the way it touched me that Christmas Eve night, I hope you will share it with others who might need to remember that love persists even when presence is no longer possible, and that sometimes the most profound gifts we can offer each other are simple acts of witness and service, and the courage to allow sacred moments to unfold without interference from practical concerns that seem important until we encounter experiences that remind us what actually matters in lives that are too brief and too precious to waste on anything, except the relationships and rituals that connect us to sources of meaning that transcend individual existence. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about the unexpected ways human beings care for each other during the darkest hours when ordinary kindness becomes extraordinary grace. And tell me in the comments about moments when strangers showed you compassion that changed how you understand the world, or times when you had opportunities to serve as witness to love, expressed in ways that surprised you with their beauty and power to heal hearts that seemed beyond repair. Your stories matter as much as mine, and together we can create a community that celebrates the sacred moments that happen every day in ordinary places when people choose connection over isolation and service over self-protection and love over fear of getting involved in situations that require more than professional competence and impersonal efficiency.